Snow came down on Loch Dhu like a held breath finally released, soft but relentless, muting the village as Hogmanay crept toward midnight. The house on the brae, Morag Calder's old place, stood dark except for one stubborn light burning in the upper window, a yellow eye refusing sleep. That light was the first thing anyone noticed was wrong. By 11:30 the village was already thick with anticipation. Whiskey bottles waited on mantelpieces, shortbread cooled on windowsills, and Morag Calder was meant to host the first footing, as she had every year since anyone could remember. But Morag did not answer her door. She did not answer her phone. And the light upstairs stayed on, unwavering, as if daring someone to look closer. It was Mrs. McLean who climbed the path first, boots crunching through fresh snow, muttering that Morag would never forgive them all if the bells rang without her dram poured. She knocked, sharp and brisk. No answer. She tried the handle and found it locked, solid and stubborn. All the downstairs windows were fastened tight, curtains drawn. There were no footprints except her own and the clean, untouched slope of snow that had fallen since dusk. By the time the constable arrived, the crowd had grown uneasy. Something about a locked house on Hogmanay felt wrong in a way that set teeth on edge. The constable circled the building with a torch, its beams sliding over stone and frost. No broken glass, no forced entry. At the back, the kitchen window was sealed from the inside, a line of condensation tracing its edges like a careful signature. The only disturbance in the snow was beneath the upstairs window, a scatter of white ash, half buried, as though someone had dropped a handful and the wind had tried, and failed, to erase it. They waited for Hamish Macbeth. He arrived with the cold clinging to his coat and a look of mild irritation that vanished the moment he saw the ash. Hamish crouched, brushed it with a gloved finger, and sniffed. Wood ash, clean and pale, not coal. He straightened slowly and looked up at the glowing window. "That's not random," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "That's a message, or someone wanted it to look like one." The door was opened with a key taken from Morag's flower pot, just where she always kept it, which only deepened the unease. Inside, the house was neat to the point of severity. A kettle sat cold on the stove. A tray of untouched glasses waited by the fire, lined up with ritual care. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of Morag at all. The silence pressed in, broken only by the ticking of the clock counting down the last minutes of the year. Upstairs, the bedroom door was locked from the inside. Hamish felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the quiet click of a puzzle assembling itself without asking permission. The door yielded only after the constable forced the old lock. The room beyond was warm, almost stuffy, the air heavy with peat smoke. The fire in the small grate had burned low but not out, and that was strange enough. Morag was meticulous. She never left a fire unattended. The bed was empty, perfectly made. On the dressing table lay Morag's watch, stopped at 11:17, its glass uncracked. Beside it sat a small bowl containing more of the same pale ash found outside, arranged in a careful circle. No note. No sign of where she had gone. The window was closed and latched, the snow on the sill pristine. A woman does not vanish from a locked room without help or planning, Hamish thought. And Morag Calder was not the sort to disappear on a whim, least of all on Hogmanay. As the bells began to ring in the distance, muffled by snow and stone, Hamish looked around the room again, slower this time. The fire. The ash. The watch stopped too neatly to be accidental. It all felt staged, like a simple trick daring him to miss the point. Either Morag was dead somewhere they hadn't thought to look, or she had walked out of her own life with the precision of someone who wanted to be followed, but only by the right person. Outside, the village welcomed the new year with cheers that faltered when they reached the house on the brae. Inside, Hamish Macbeth stood in the locked bedroom, listening to the echo of celebration, knowing that whatever had happened here had begun long before midnight, and that the ash, so carefully placed, was the first lie he would have to unravel. Hamish stayed in the bedroom long after the constable had finished his cursory notes. He let the others drift downstairs, their boots thudding heavily, their voices already slipping into speculation. Silence suited him. Silence lets small things speak. The fire was the first, not the grate itself, but the way the peat had been stacked, careful, deliberate, meant to burn slow and steady. Morag knew of fires. If she'd planned to be out late, she would have let it die. If she'd planned to stay in, it would have been blazing. This half-measure suggested interruption. Someone had wanted warmth, but not for long. He knelt again by the bowl of ash. Too clean, too sorted. Ash that tidy didn't come from neglect. It came from intention. Hamish glanced at the hearth and then at the bowl, measuring the distance with his eyes. Someone had carried it, which meant Morag, or someone else, had stood here long enough to think about how it would look. Downstairs, the house felt colder, as if the warmth had been a private affair confined to that locked room. Hamish moved through the kitchen, noting the untouched kettle and the row of glasses. One glass, however, was slightly out of line, its rim smudged faintly. He lifted it, sniffed. Whiskey, yes, but something sharper beneath it, almost medicinal. He set it back exactly where it had been. The villagers hovered in small knots. New Year cheer dulled into anxious murmurs. Hamish scanned faces the way other men scanned newspapers. Mrs. McLean was openly distraught, wringing her hands and repeating that Morag would never miss Hogmanay. Mr. Fraser stood stiffly apart, arms crossed too tightly, his eyes flicking to the house and away again, as if afraid it might look back. "Anyone been up to see her earlier?" Hamish asked lightly, as though the answer hardly mattered. There was a pause, a fraction too long. Then Mrs. McLean spoke. "I was by around 4, dropped off the shortbread. She was fine. Bit distracted maybe, but that's Morag." "Distracted how?" Hamish asked. "Oh, you know, thinking about arrangements. She said she had things to finish upstairs." Hamish nodded, filing the phrase away. Things to finish was vague enough to hide anything. Mr. Fraser cleared his throat. "I saw her at dusk, passing by the house." She waved. He made a small gesture with his hand as if reenacting it. "Nothing amiss." Hamish watched him closely. The wave was easy to remember. The details around it were not. Did she say anything? No. Too quick. Just a wave. Hamish thanked them and turned back toward the house, his mind already threading connections. If Morag had been seen at dusk, then whatever happened occurred in a narrow window. The stopped watch suggested precision, not panic. Someone had wanted time to be noted, or misunderstood. He went back inside and climbed the stairs again, slower now. In the bedroom, he examined the door frame. A faint scratch near the latch caught his eye, easily missed, easily dismissed as age. Hamish pressed his thumb against it and frowned. Fresh, not forced but tested. Someone had locked this door carefully, perhaps from the outside, perhaps not as confidently as they hoped. At the window, he leaned close to the glass. No frost on the inside, which meant it had been opened recently and closed again, just long enough to scatter ash into the snow below. Not an accident, a signal, or a distraction. A thought nudged him, unwelcome and persistent. He looked again at the watch on the dressing table. Morag always wore it, even around the house. Why take it off? Unless she didn't intend to need it. Unless time, for her, had already served its purpose. When Hamish returned downstairs, he found the constable speaking quietly with Mr. Fraser. Fraser's voice dropped when he noticed Hamish, his shoulders tightening by degrees. Hamish pretended not to notice and bent to examine the mat by the door. Damp. Not from snow, no grit, no salt. From water. Someone had wiped their shoes. Someone careful. Right, Hamish said at last, straightening. Morag didn't vanish into thin air, and she didn't leave by accident. Someone wanted this to look impossible. Locked door? Tidy Ash stopped watch. That's theatre. The constable blinked. So, foul play? Hamish glanced toward the stairs, toward the room that still held its warmth like a secret, or a lie dressed up as a mystery. And lies, he added softly, don't usually stand alone. Outside, the celebrations had faded into uneasy quiet. Hamish stepped into the cold, his breath fogging the air, and looked once more at the upstairs window. Whatever Morag Calder had done, or whatever had been done to her, had been planned with care. And someone in Lochdu already knew far more than they were saying. Hamish called the villagers into the sitting room, the peat fire now just a gentle glow, and motioned for them to sit. The constable shuffled papers nervously on the mantel, clearly glad to have Hamish take the lead. Hamish began quietly, letting his gaze settle on each person in turn. There was Mrs. McLean, still wringing her hands. Mr. Fraser, stoic but with a twitch at the corner of his eye, and a few others who had drifted up in curiosity, drawn by the unbroken light and the stopped watch. "Let's go over what happened today," Hamish said. His voice was calm, measured, but underneath it carried a weight that made people pause before speaking. Who saw Morag last, and at what time? Mrs. McLean spoke first, her voice tight. "As I said, around 4 in the afternoon. I dropped off the shortbread. She seemed preoccupied. I didn't notice anything unusual." She smiled faintly, but Hamish's sharp eyes caught the slight tremor in her hands, the avoidance of his direct gaze. "And you, Mr. Fraser?" Hamish asked. Fraser leaned back, stiff as a poker. "I saw her around dusk, walking past the front of the house. She waved. That's all. She didn't say a word." Hamish's gaze lingered. "Dusk," he repeated, letting the word hang. "And you are certain of the time?" "Yes. I remember. It was just before I fed the sheep." His voice was even, but Hamish noticed the too perfect precision. People rarely recalled exact minutes, unless they wanted to appear meticulous. From the corner of the room, a younger villager spoke up, hesitant. I think I saw someone leave Morag's house later, maybe after 6. Hard to say, it was snowing." Hamish leaned forward. "And can you describe them?" The boy hesitated. "I'm not sure. Tall, coat, hat, that's all." "Interesting," Hamish murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He noticed Mrs. McLean glance sharply at Fraser, then quickly down at her lap, as if catching herself before speaking. Fraser's jaw tightened, and his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. Something about their reactions didn't sit right. "Did anyone else see her between 4 and dusk?" Hamish asked. Silence fell. Then a woman near the door spoke, voice tentative. "I thought I heard voices in the house. I didn't look. Maybe 5:30? Hamish tilted his head, listening not only to her words but to the pauses, the inflections, the parts she didn't say. Voices in the house. That matched the earlier clues, the disturbance of the ash, the careful placement. Someone had been there, intentionally, leaving a trail. Did anyone notice anything else odd? He pressed gently. A man cleared his throat. Well, her cat, Angus, he was nowhere to be found. Not in the kitchen, not in the parlour. Usually he's under the table, always underfoot. I thought that strange. Hamish's eyes narrowed. Cats were unpredictable, yes, but absence could be as deliberate as presence. The small things, movements, omissions, reactions, spoke louder than any testimony. He returned to Fraser. "You said you saw her walking past the house at dusk. Did she carry anything?" Fraser hesitated, just enough to register. "No, I don't think so. Maybe a bag. I'm not certain." Hamish leaned back, steepling his fingers. Each version he'd heard had inconsistencies. The boy's vague sighting, the woman's half-heard voices, the cat's disappearance. They weren't outright contradictions, but they were pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet form a picture. More telling, though, were the reactions, the slight flinches, the evasive glances. Someone in this room was hiding something, and perhaps not even fully aware that they had already given themselves away. He let the silence stretch a beat longer, letting the tension settle like snow in a quiet corner. "Thank you," he said finally. "That will be all for now. Please stay available. I may need to ask more questions." As the villagers shuffled out, Hamish remained seated, staring at the fire. Each person had their story. Each story had its cracks. And those cracks, he knew, were where the truth would seep through. He traced the paths in his mind, the stopped watch, the half-burned fire, the tidy ash, the glimpsed figures outside. Someone had orchestrated the scene to seem impossible, but the details, the minute hesitations, the whispered corrections, the things left unsaid, were already giving him the shape of the plan. Rose, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside again into the biting wind. The bells had long stopped, leaving only the hush of new snow and the distant hum of voices. Somewhere in Lochdu, the person who thought they had hidden the truth perfectly was already moving, confident. Hamish tightened his scarf and knew that confidence was about to meet the cold, unrelenting eye of observation. Hamish spent the next morning retracing the steps of everyone connected to Morag Calder, letting the wind whip across the brae as he made mental notes of interactions, grudges, and hidden tensions that simmered beneath Lochdu's sleepy exterior. Each house he passed whispered fragments of gossip, small grievances, and veiled envy. By mid-morning, he had a map of potential motives sprawling in his mind like frost patterns on glass. No single thread explained everything. Instead, he saw a maze, and every twist might hide both truth and deception. He started with Mrs. McLean, who had arrived first at the house the previous night. The woman was fiercely loyal to Morag, or so everyone said, but Hamish noticed something in her hesitation, a faint defensiveness that spoke of more than concern. She had been the one to mention the shortbread, the first visit of the day, yet her recollection was too neat. People rarely remembered exact times unless it mattered to them. Perhaps it did. And why the glance at Fraser? Something had passed silently between them. Fraser himself was another tangle, a man proud of his order and precision, yet subtly perturbed when asked about Morag carrying a bag. The twitch in his jaw, the way he measured words, suggested either concealment or fear of judgment. Hamish remembered small village feuds from years past. Fraser's land dealings, petty disputes with neighbours, a few late-night arguments with Morag herself about farm rights and water access. Was it resentment, or had something escalated beyond talk? Even the younger witnesses contributed threads to the maze. The boy who claimed to have seen a figure leaving Morag's house after 6, unsure of the details, was not lying, but uncertainty could shield truth. And the woman who heard voices inside the house at 5:30 hinted at an intruder, or at least at the presence of someone who didn't belong. Each recollection overlapped with another, yet contradicted in detail, forming an intricate web that defied immediate understanding. Hamish returned to the house on the brae, letting his eyes linger on the small, mundane signs the others ignored, the faint smudge on the mantel where someone had rested a hand, the slightly ajar cupboard door in the kitchen, the cold kettle that had not been used. Each imperfection suggested human presence, careful movement, and hidden intent. Morag Calder had enemies, yes, but perhaps also allies who acted on impulse or fear. He examined the ash again. A symbol or a message, perhaps. Someone trying to mislead or mislead themselves. Was it meant to signal someone or to confound anyone who entered? Whoever had left it knew Morag's habits intimately. Whoever had staged the scene was close enough to anticipate every move. The locked bedroom door, the stopped watch, the tidy fire. That required knowledge, familiarity, and motive. Greed was an obvious contender. Morag's small estate was valuable, more so than the humble appearance of the house suggested. Some villagers would have gained from her absence, or her removal, yet the timing, precise and chillingly orchestrated, hinted at more than simple theft. Revenge, perhaps, though the reasons for vengeance were buried under years of unremarkable village life. A quarrel, an insult remembered too long, a pride wounded. Any could have pushed someone to manipulate the scene rather than confront directly. Jealousy lingered in subtle forms. Fraser's interactions with Morag, the half-hidden resentment in his posture, the silent competition over influence and property, these hinted at emotions older than the snow. Mrs. Maclean, outwardly devoted, might have coveted social approval or feared replacement in Morag's circle. Even the younger villagers, unremarkable at first glance, could have been driven by petty envy or fear of scorn, enough to participate in deception they barely understood themselves. Hamish folded the pieces in his mind like a puzzle. Each suspect had reason, each alibi contained a crack, each story offered shades of truth mingled with lies. No single theory held, every motive intersected, overlapped, contradicted. It was a maze of human emotion, greed brushing against fear, jealousy hiding beneath loyalty, resentment disguised as concern. Navigating it required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to read silence as easily as speech. By late afternoon, Hamish stepped outside once more, the snow now crusted into icy patterns along the path. He looked at the village, quiet under the low winter sun, and considered each motive, each connection, each hesitation he had observed. Somewhere within this tangle of human intent the truth waited, carefully hidden but tangible. The maze was complex, yes, but not unsolvable. And Hamish Macbeth, with his patient eye for detail, knew that the first misstep from the person weaving this web would be all he needed to unravel it. Hamish returned to the house that evening, boots crunching on the hardened snow, and found the constable waiting by the door with a small, triumphant expression that Hamish immediately found suspect. In his hand was a leather-bound notebook, its edges worn, pages marked with hurried notes. "Found this in Morag's garden shed," the constable said, holding it out. "Looks like a diary. There's a page torn out, but it mentions Fraser meeting her at dusk yesterday. He admits he took the stopped watch to keep track of her movements. Case closed, I'd say." The other villagers gathered around, nodding and murmuring in relief. Fraser looked pale, hands clenching his coat, but his lips pressed into a thin line of acceptance. Mrs. Maclean's shoulders sagged, as if a weight had lifted. Hamish, however, only raised an eyebrow. He flipped through the diary carefully, noting the neat, looping handwriting and the rhythm of dates and times. The entry did mention Fraser meeting Morag, but there were no details, no indication of motive, no hint of coercion, no mention of anyone else. The constable's eagerness to pin the crime on him struck Hamish as premature. It was too convenient, too tidy. "Have you asked Fraser about this directly?" Hamish inquired, voice calm but probing. "Yes," the constable replied. "He admits it. He says he just checked on her, that's all." "And you believe him?" Hamish asked slowly, feeling the words hang like frost in the air. The constable hesitated, frowning. "Well, yes. If the diary says it, it must be true." Hamish shook his head. Diaries were personal, yes, but they could be altered, misread, or manipulated. He glanced again at the torn page, noting the jagged edges, the ink slightly smeared. Someone had removed something important, carefully, leaving only enough to mislead anyone not paying attention. "Let's check the garden shed," Hamish suggested, stepping outside. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of peat smoke and frost. The shed was a small, cramped space, filled with old tools, stacks of firewood and gardening implements. Hamish crouched, examining the ground near the doorway. The footprints were mostly obscured by fresh snow, but a faint impression caught his eye, smaller, lighter, almost hidden behind Fraser's more obvious marks. He traced it with a gloved finger. The pattern suggested someone had been there recently, someone trying to retrieve or replace something without leaving clear evidence. Not Fraser. Someone else, someone waiting in the shadows while the scene was staged to appear simple. Back inside, the villagers had begun congratulating the constable, already assuming the mystery solved. Hamish watched them carefully, noting the tension under the surface of their smiles. Relief and pride often masked guilt or fear, and he had seen enough of human behaviour to know when a so-called breakthrough was an illusion. He lingered in the kitchen, letting the chatter fade into the hum of the fire. His eyes fell on the kettle again, still cold, and the cupboard door slightly ajar. Small signs of intrusion, nothing overt, nothing dramatic, yet consistent with a presence that had been cautious, deliberate. The diary and the supposed confession were distractions, a neat story that satisfied everyone except the one paying attention. Hamish's gaze returned to Fraser, who sat rigid, nodding along with the applause, but not quite at ease. There was a rigidity in his posture that suggested rehearsal, not guilt, a man learning to mimic acceptance. And Mrs. McLean, her glance toward Fraser now carried a new edge, one that Hamish recognised as worry, or perhaps knowledge of something she dared not speak aloud. Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the sounds of the village. Hamish stepped to the window, watching shadows stretch along the path. Somewhere among those shadows, the person who had orchestrated the staged evidence was still moving freely, confident that the false victory would buy them time. Confident that no one suspected, that the real plan remained invisible. Hamish exhaled slowly, a cloud of mist curling in the cold air. The puzzle was not complete. The breakthrough was only the first trap, set to make the authorities feel secure. He knew better. Whoever had orchestrated Morag Calder's disappearance had anticipated every obvious move, every eager assumption. And now, with the village settling into a sense of premature triumph, that person could act again, unseen, while the world cheered a solution that was anything but real. Hamish tightened his scarf and turned back to the fire, mind already threading through timelines, motives, and hidden opportunities. The real criminal was waiting, and he would not wait long. Hamish returned to Morag's house the following morning, the wind cutting across the brae, carrying with it the sharp tang of frost and the faint peat smoke from neighbouring chimneys. He walked slowly, boots leaving deliberate prints, letting his mind wander through old memories as much as the present. Sometimes the answers were hidden not in what was new, but in what had been long forgotten. He paused at the foot of the stairs, eyeing the ash-strewn path outside the upper window. It had been the first clue, overlooked for its simplicity, yet it whispered of intention. As he studied it again, a thought struck him. The patterns of deception often mirrored old behaviours, old grudges. He remembered, with a sudden clarity, a minor dispute from nearly 10 years ago, an argument between Fraser and Morag over a property line that had barely made the local gossip pages. Small, seemingly insignificant at the time, but bitterness could linger, festering under polite smiles and casual greetings. Hamish made his way upstairs, scanning the bedroom with renewed scrutiny. His eyes fell on a small picture frame that had been slightly turned, not enough to draw attention immediately, but enough to suggest recent handling. Inside was an old photograph of Morag with another woman he had seen only in passing, Mrs. McLean, both younger and smiling in a way that suggested friendship. Something about the photograph tugged at the corner of Hamish's memory. He crouched, noting the scuff on the frame's back, the faint indentation on the wall where it had hung before. A connection formed in his mind. That was the missing piece, the hidden history between McLean and Morag. Their camaraderie had once been deep, possibly even rivalrous in ways the village had forgotten. Perhaps McLean's loyalty was not purely devotion, but shaped by years of comparison, of competition, of resentment quietly buried beneath good manners and public smiles. Hamish turned to the notebook found in the shed. The torn page that the constable had hailed as proof against Fraser now seemed part of a larger puzzle. Whoever had removed it had known exactly how it would be interpreted, exploiting the gaps of memory and the assumptions of the authorities. This was not merely a crime of opportunity, it was a crime woven with the threads of past grievances. He pulled on his gloves and walked back to the village, tracing the faint paths that led between the houses. He paused outside Fraser's, eyes catching the subtle repairs on the gate, newly replaced hinges and a lock that gleamed despite frost. The kind of work someone does when they want to hide evidence or erase history. Fraser, Hamish realised, was not acting alone. Connections went deeper, intertwining lives in ways that were invisible to casual observation. Later he spoke quietly with an elderly villager who had known both Morag and Maclean decades ago. The woman recalled a dispute long buried, a disagreement over inheritance, over leadership in village committees, and a minor scandal involving a lost ledger from a community fund. None of it had mattered much at the time, quickly forgotten in the bustle of village life. But memory, Hamish thought, is like snow. It settles, covering everything, until footsteps disturb it, revealing what lies beneath. The realization hit him fully. The disappearance was not about money alone, nor simple mischief, nor a spontaneous act of malice. It was about old grievances, old alliances, and the invisible debts and resentments that had accumulated over years. The ash, the stopped watch, the tidy fire, all were gestures carefully designed to mislead, but the motives had deep roots, anchoring the present in a past almost everyone had forgotten. Hamish returned to Morag's house once more as twilight fell, the cold settling around the eaves like a cloak. He looked at the bedroom window, at the carefully placed ash and the neat circle in the bowl, and understood the layers of deception. One thread tied Mrs. Maclean and Fraser together, another reached back to minor disputes and buried jealousies, and somewhere the real orchestrator moved confidently, assuming that the tangled past could mask their actions. He leaned against the doorway, considering the paths that lay ahead. The case was no longer merely about locating Morag or exposing a simple suspect. It was about untangling history itself, peeling back layers of old ambition, rivalry, and resentment. Each shadow cast by the past had a role to play in the present, and until Hamish Macbeth could trace those shadows, the true criminal would remain hidden, poised to strike again with the assurance of one who knew the past had already done half the work for them. Outside, the snow pressed down quietly, muffling the village, hiding footprints yet to be made, and Hamish's mind, sharp and steady, traced the web that connected every lie, every hesitation, and every long-forgotten grievance. The game had changed. The past was now the key, and he would follow it wherever it led. Hamish spent the early hours of the evening sitting by the fire in Morag's sitting room, letting the glow illuminate the neat edges of the furniture, the faint smudges on the mantel, the slight misalignment of the rug by the door. It was in these minutiae, he knew, that the story whispered itself to those patient enough to listen. The constable hovered awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot, clearly impatient for a conventional breakthrough. Hamish ignored him. Conventional was rarely enough. He had decided to employ a different tactic, one not of accusation but of observation, something that required no forced confessions, no hurried interrogations, just careful attention and a quiet test of character. He called Fraser and Mrs. Maclean to the room under the guise of re-examining the diary. The villagers' earlier relief hung in the air like smoke, their sense of closure still fragile and expectant. "Let's try something," Hamish said casually, his voice low but steady. He placed the diary on the table, flipped it open, and drew attention to a blank page, one untouched, perfectly clean. Morag wrote here often, even mundane things. But notice, sometimes she left gaps, and those gaps tell us as much as the writing. If you were handling her affairs or worried about her, your attention would naturally drift to the spaces she left. Fraser's eyes flicked to the page and lingered a beat too long. He smiled faintly, almost dismissively, but his fingers flexed nervously against the edge of his coat. Mrs. Maclean, sitting stiffly, leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning the page with a precision that suggested preoccupation rather than casual interest. Hamish let the silence stretch, observing the subtle tells, the micro-expressions. "Now," Hamish continued, leaning back, "imagine you had reason to interfere with her schedule, her plans. You might attempt to mislead, yes? Leave a sign, a clue, or a distraction. But if you were careful, too careful, you might overdo it, draw attention to yourself without realizing it." He watched Fraser's jaw tighten imperceptibly, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the momentary twitch of his fingers. "Interesting," Hamish murmured, almost to himself. "People who stage, who plan meticulously, often leave traces not where they mean to. They overcompensate in the obvious, but something small slips through." He tapped the blank page with a gloved finger. A mark, a smear, a reaction. Something tells us more than the diary itself ever could. He let the words hang, then changed his tone to something conversational, almost casual. "You know, sometimes I like to test people not by what they say, but by what they don't notice. Small things, overlooked things, can provoke a response, can reveal intent. The truth hides in those gaps." Fraser shifted uncomfortably, and that slight, almost imperceptible movement was all Hamish needed. A hand brushed the page as though to steady himself, yet it lingered a moment longer than necessary. The eyes darted toward the window, then back at Hamish, the flicker of unease revealing far more than the confident composure he tried to maintain. Mrs. Maclean's posture stiffened as well, but more in apprehension than fear. Her loyalty now tinged with subtle hesitation, a reaction Hamish filed away carefully. "Curious," Hamish said softly, watching them both. "Sometimes we react to things we think are harmless. A blank page, a minor detail, a question framed a certain way. And yet those reactions, micro-expressions, gestures, pauses, are often the most honest parts of our behaviour." The constable frowned. "I don't understand," he muttered. Hamish smiled faintly, almost indulgently. "That's the point. What seems insignificant, trivial, even accidental, is rarely so. One's manner, one's attention, one's instinctive movements, they betray far more than words ever could." Fraser shifted again, this time too quickly, and Hamish caught the flicker of fear beneath the practised calm. A crack had appeared in the careful facade, subtle yet unmistakable. Hamish's mind began threading it into the larger puzzle, the diary, the ash, the stopped watch, the tangled history, the staged footprints. The reaction had confirmed what he already suspected. Someone was hiding more than they admitted, and this was not mere error or distraction. He let the moment stretch, keeping his calm like a net, observing the layers of tension, hesitation, and micro-expression. The real story, he knew, was surfacing not in confessions, but in the shadows of behaviour, in the tiny, unconscious cracks that only patience and careful attention could reveal. And somewhere, within those cracks, he would find the thread that led to the truth. Hamish spent the remainder of the day following the subtle threads the unconventional clue had revealed. He retraced steps, questioned villagers in quiet corners, and reviewed the diary and its blank pages for patterns he had not yet noticed. Each moment brought him closer to seeing how the threads of past grievances, staged evidence, and the subtle reactions of Fraser and Mrs. Maclean intertwined. By late afternoon, he returned to the shed where the diary had been discovered, intending to examine it one more time under better light. The constable followed, confident that they were on the cusp of closure. Hamish's eyes swept across the shed with his practised care, noting dust patterns, the way tools leaned, and faint impressions in the dirt floor. But the diary was gone. Gone? the constable said sharply, glancing around, clearly flustered. "It was right here an hour ago." Hamish's eyes narrowed. The leather cover had been removed carefully, no scuff marks, no footprints leading away, just a clean erasure. "Someone wanted it to disappear," he murmured, more to himself than to the constable. "Deliberately. Timed it so we would think it was still here." They checked the surrounding area, sweeping snow around the shed and examining the walls, but there were no traces. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. Whoever had taken the diary had been meticulous, leaving only a faint sense of absence that Hamish could feel more than see. Back at the house, he began to consider the implications. The diary had been the only tangible link connecting Fraser, the staged evidence, and the subtle cracks in Mrs. Maclean's composure. Without it, much of the momentum gathered over the past 2 days threatened to collapse. The theft was a message, not merely a practical act. It was meant to unsettle, to make them doubt the strength of their observations, to buy the perpetrator time. Hamish walked slowly through the house, noting the small things that remained, the faint smudge on the mantel, the slightly shifted rug, the indentation on the floor where someone had knelt. Each silent sign, overlooked by others, now felt more significant in the absence of the diary. The person responsible was aware of the investigative trail and was actively working to erase it. That knowledge alone elevated the stakes. He gathered Fraser and Mrs. Maclean again in the sitting room, watching carefully as they responded to the news. Fraser's face paled slightly, his hands clenching into fists and releasing almost immediately. Mrs. Maclean's eyes darted to the window as if measuring the wind or anticipating a visitor. Both reacted, but differently. One betrayed fear, the other calculation. The duality fascinated Hamish. One reaction was instinct, the other learned. "The diary is missing," Hamish announced softly, letting the words linger in the room. Whoever took it understood its importance. They wanted to slow us down, or mislead us entirely. That tells us more than you might think. Fraser swallowed hard, looking away, then back. I don't know anything about it," he said quickly. His composure teetered, a subtle quiver in the voice that Hamish noted carefully. Mrs. Maclean remained still, her hands folded, lips pressed, eyes calculating. "Nor I," she said quietly. Too precise to be entirely believable, Hamish studied them, the two pairs of eyes reflecting different types of stress. Guilt, fear, and self-preservation mingled with careful restraint. The absence of the diary did not confuse him, rather it sharpened the investigation. Whoever had orchestrated this move understood their own narrative, and that understanding left traces in behaviour, in timing, in the choices they made while believing themselves unseen. He moved to the window and watched the village below. The snow muffled all but the faintest movement. Whoever was working against him had vanished into it, confident their actions would remain unnoticed. Trust, Hamish realised, was now fragile in every encounter. Every smile, every polite answer, every minor gesture had to be re-examined. The real challenge lay not in finding missing evidence, but in tracing the mind that had removed it. Hamish returned to the fire, his breath forming thin clouds in the cold air of the house. The vanishing diary was a warning, a subtle escalation. The threads of the mystery were no longer merely entangled in past grievances and staged clues. They were actively under attack, and the longer the perpetrator remained undetected, the higher the stakes would rise and the more dangerous the shadows would become. The game had shifted. Now the pursuit itself had become a test of patience, observation, and the ability to anticipate an adversary who had already proven cunning enough to vanish without a trace. The next morning, Lochdu woke to a pale, brittle light that seemed to fracture across rooftops and frozen fields. Hamish was already awake, pacing the bedroom of Morag's house, reviewing timelines and mental notes, when a sharp knock at the door broke the quiet. The constable entered, pale and anxious, clutching a telegram in his hand. "It's Mrs. Maclean," he said without preamble. She's gone." Hamish froze, letting the words settle. Gone. Not missing in the sense of wandering off, not late for tea. Gone. His mind raced, tracing the threads, replaying every micro-expression, every hesitation from the previous day. The diary's disappearance, the subtle cracks in Fraser's composure, the calculated reactions of Maclean, they had all been signals pointing towards someone who anticipated every move. Now, one of the key witnesses, one of the closest to Morag, had vanished. Hamish pulled on his coat, boots crunching across the frost-hardened floor. Outside, the village seemed unusually still, aware of the tension but unsure where it might land. The constable followed in silence, glancing at each house, each shadow, the distant hills promising nothing but white and cold. They reached Mrs. Maclean's home, a neat stone cottage at the edge of the village. The door stood ajar, snow drifting in along the threshold. Inside, the room was undisturbed except for a faint trace, a chair overturned, a scattering of papers from her ledger, and the smell of faint smoke lingering in the corner where a peat fire had burned. Hamish crouched, noting footprints leading away from the door, footprints that disappeared into the fresh snow as if the person had been carried or guided. Small, careful, deliberate. Not a struggle, but a planned extraction. "This isn't random," Hamish muttered. His eyes scanned every angle, every shadow. Whoever is behind Morag's disappearance and the diary theft is escalating. They want control of the narrative, and they're willing to manipulate people directly to get it. He returned to the village immediately, retracing the faint tracks from Mrs. Maclean's cottage. Halfway along the frozen path, he paused at a turn in the road, noticing something odd. A small scrap of paper, crumpled but legible. It was part of a ledger torn neatly, the same handwriting as the diary. Hamish crouched, examining the markings. The numbers made no sense at first, but the pattern suggested intentional coding, perhaps a message to someone in the village, or a warning. Before he could ponder it further, the constable gasped, pointing toward the far edge of the village. A shadow moved too quickly along the wall of Fraser's barn, slipping behind the corner, unseen and untraceable. Hamish's eyes followed, noting the speed and deliberation of the figure. Someone was watching, assessing, testing. Someone who already knew exactly how far Hamish would go, exactly how he would react. The realization hit him fully. This was no longer just about solving Morag's disappearance or uncovering who had taken the diary. The perpetrator was active, responsive, several steps ahead, using the village as a stage for both misdirection and intimidation. Every move Hamish had made so far had been anticipated. Every observation, every deduction had been accounted for. And now, with Maclean gone, and the shadow slipping through the streets, the stakes had doubled. He turned back to the constable. "We must assume the person responsible will act again if we hesitate. This isn't just investigation anymore, it's prevention. We have to predict the next step before it happens, or someone else may vanish." The constable nodded, though uneasily. Hamish's mind was already weaving the threads, past grievances, the staged ash, the stolen diary, Fraser's uneasy composure, the subtle cracks in Maclean's behaviour, all converging into a pattern of escalating control. Whoever orchestrated this was confident, meticulous, and increasingly audacious. Hamish drew a deep breath, letting the cold burn his lungs. The snow crunched underfoot as he led the constable back toward the centre of the village, thinking of every possible hideout, every narrow passage, every shadow where someone could lie in wait. This was no longer merely a puzzle to solve, it was a game of anticipation, of reading subtle signals, of moving faster than a mind already several steps ahead. As he scanned the rooftops and alleyways, Hamish realized the truth of it. The villain was still out there, orchestrating events with precision, testing reactions, and daring him to follow. And if he didn't act with both caution and speed, The next disappearance might not be someone willing to return quietly. The case had shifted from deduction to survival, and the next hours would prove whether Hamish Macbeth could anticipate a mind as cunning as his own, or if the shadows would claim another victim before dawn. Hamish walked the village streets as twilight deepened into a bruised purple, the snow hard beneath his boots, crunching in rhythmic punctuation to his thoughts. The events of the past days, the staged ash, the missing diary, Fraser's uneasy movements, Mrs. McLean's disappearance, had created a haze of conjecture and fear, yet a thread had begun to form, thin and nearly invisible, connecting all the scattered pieces. He just needed to follow it carefully, without letting the noise of panic or assumption cloud his attention. He returned to the brae, letting his gaze linger on Morag's house. Something about the upper window nagged at him. The way the frost on the sill was slightly uneven, a faint trace of disturbance like a fingerprint against the cold glass. His eyes drifted to the small ash circle in the bowl. The watch stopped at 11:17, and the half-burned peat fire. Each detail had seemed isolated, perhaps even misleading. Yet now they whispered a sequence, a logic embedded in minor gestures and overlooked habits. He thought back to the villagers' reactions during questioning. Fraser's sudden tension at the mention of the blank diary page. McLean's careful measurement of her glances and posture, the micro-expression of anxiety when confronted with a trivial remark. The clues were behavioural, subtle, yet consistent. Hamish replayed each interaction in his mind, piecing them together like a delicate mosaic. And then it struck him, an offhand comment made by Mrs. McLean days before, easily dismissed at the time. She had remarked, almost casually, about the arrangement of Morag's ash bowl, how she had always preferred it tidy, like a ritual. It was such a small observation, almost mundane. But Hamish now saw its significance. Whoever had staged the scene had relied on that very habit, turning Morag's meticulousness into a weapon of misdirection. The ash circle wasn't random. It was a precise echo of Morag's own practices, a signal meant to convince anyone entering the room that she had orchestrated her disappearance herself. Hamish crouched, tracing a finger along the floor near the hearth, where the faintest smudge of peat dust lingered. It connected the room to the outside, a subtle trail previously overlooked. The person responsible had mimicked Morag's behaviours to control the narrative, to make her absence appear voluntary. Even the stopped watch now seemed deliberate, another layer of the illusion. Each small act, each borrowed habit, had been a brushstroke in a larger deception, and Hamish could finally see the pattern. He returned to the ledger fragment found near McLean's cottage. The torn numbers and coded marks, previously a confusing jumble, now made sense within the context of the behavioural pattern. They were meant to signal to someone who understood Morag's routines and the village's rhythm, a clandestine communication hidden in plain sight. The person orchestrating these events was someone intimately familiar with both women, their habits, their relationships, and the expectations of the village. Hamish sat back against the doorway, letting the revelation settle. The pattern connected every strand of the investigation: the missing diary, the stolen and manipulated evidence, the subtle reactions of Fraser and McLean, even the timing of McLean's disappearance. It all pointed toward a mind both cunning and patient, one that understood the power of minor details and the ease with which others could be misled by what seemed ordinary. He rose, walking deliberately toward the constable, who had been nervously observing the shadows outside. "It's been in front of us all along," Hamish said quietly. "Every misdirection, every stolen object, every hesitation we noticed. It wasn't random. Someone has been using knowledge of habits, routines, and human behaviour to orchestrate events with precision. The pattern is subtle, but it's there. and it reveals far more than the obvious clues ever could. The constable blinked, trying to follow, but Hamish's eyes were already scanning the village streets. The shadows, the silent corners, the slight disturbances in snow and frost, they were all part of the pattern now. Whoever had engineered the disappearance and the staged evidence had assumed control of the narrative, but Hamish now held the key. The revelation brought clarity without relief. The criminal remained several steps ahead, but now Hamish knew how to anticipate them, to watch for the deviations from the habitual, the borrowed behaviours, the subtle manipulations that had been hidden in plain sight. Every minor gesture, every overlooked habit, every faint mark was a signpost. The pattern was clear, and following it, Hamish realised, would lead him not just to the truth of Morag Calder's disappearance, but to the person who had thought themselves untouchable. Hamish returned to Morag's house just as the last pale light of day was fading, the windows reflecting the bruised twilight like mirrors to the village's quiet tension. He walked slowly through the sitting room, eyes lingering on the ash bowl, the hearth, and the faint smudge on the mantel. Each detail had already whispered its secrets once, yet now they seemed to murmur something more, a message he hadn't fully understood until the pattern had emerged. The true motive was no longer hidden in speculation or surface grievances. It had been encoded in behaviour all along, waiting for someone patient enough to decipher it. He called Fraser and Mrs. McLean to the room once again, insisting that the constable remain outside. The tension was immediate, palpable, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Hamish leaned against the doorway, fingers interlaced, letting the quiet speak before he began. "You've both been very careful," he said softly, watching their reactions, noting the slight stiffening in Fraser's shoulders and the almost imperceptible quiver of McLean's hand. Every move, every hesitation, every borrowed habit, it's all been part of a story you thought would remain unseen. But it has been noticed, interpreted, and understood. The pattern revealed more than the individual actions ever could. Fraser's jaw tightened. "What are you implying?" His voice was low, measured, though not entirely controlled. Hamish's gaze held steady. That the motivations behind Morag Calder's disappearance and the manipulation of evidence are far more complex than simple greed, rivalry, or revenge. This is about control, yes, but not in the material sense. It's about the need to orchestrate perception, to manipulate reality itself in a way that proves ultimately who can dominate the narrative of life in this village. Mrs. McLean's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition, and then quickly narrowed in self-restraint. Hamish let it pass, knowing she was absorbing the assessment, weighing each word against what she had long buried. The diary, the ash circle, the stopped watch, the disappearance. They weren't just tools, Hamish continued. They were statements. Acts designed to assert dominance, to make everyone believe a certain story. And that story was never about Fraser alone, nor McLean's loyalty. It was about proving that one mind, yours, could manipulate everything and everyone, even in a village small enough that a whisper could unravel your plans. Fraser's face paled, and the thin line of his lips quivered. McLean's hands tightened into fists on her knees. Hamish could see it now. The deeper motive was not money, not envy, not even revenge. It was the thrill of control, the intoxicating certainty of directing lives, bending them to one design, and watching others dance to a script they did not realize had been written for them. "You were willing to go to extreme lengths," Hamish said, voice quiet but cutting, because this was never about Morag herself. It was about the system she represented, the habits and routines she maintained, the very patterns of the village, to disrupt them, to make them bend to your will. That was the goal. The crime is psychological, not practical. Every stage detail was proof of your ability to orchestrate, to manipulate perception, to prove that nothing was beyond your control. Mrs. Maclean's lips parted, a whisper of defiance, or perhaps confession, but she said nothing. Fraser's eyes darted, searching for an escape in a room that offered none. Hamish leaned slightly forward, letting his gaze pin them, unrelenting. "You underestimated observation," he said finally. "You assumed that minor details, unconscious gestures and micro-expressions could be ignored. That deception alone would suffice. But human behavior, carefully watched, rarely lies. You left traces, not in diaries, not in ash, but in reactions, hesitation and instinct. That is where the truth always hides, and that is where I found it." For a long moment, the room was silent, the kind of silence that carries both inevitability and dread. Then, almost imperceptibly, Fraser slumped, the weight of recognition settling over him. Maclean's hands relaxed slightly, a mirror of resignation. Hamish knew the revelation had struck deeper than any accusation or interrogation could. It had illuminated the psychology behind the crime, the hidden compulsions, the thrill of control that had driven them to extremes. The motive, Hamish understood now, was a web of intellect, obsession, and desire. A desire to prove mastery over life itself, over people, over truth. And it was precisely this need that had left them exposed, no matter how meticulously they had manipulated events. The psychological drive that had orchestrated everything was also the flaw that would unravel it. Hamish stepped back from the doorway, letting the weight of his observation settle in the room. The village outside was quiet, oblivious to the storm of intentions that had been laid bare within this house. And as he watched Fraser and Maclean, Hamish realized that while the motive had been hidden in plain sight, its revelation would guide him to the final threads, the missing pieces, and ultimately, to Morag Calder herself. Hamish waited until the village had settled into its fragile evening quiet. The wind had dropped, and the snow now lay smooth and undisturbed, except for a few footprints near Morag's house, the tracks he had been following carefully for hours. He had anticipated that whoever orchestrated the disappearance and the stolen diary would act again, driven by either arrogance or desperation. Every clue, every reaction, every psychological tick pointed to a single moment where he could corner them, and he was prepared to wait for it. He arranged the sitting room to mirror Morag's habits, every object in its accustomed place, every ash circle untouched, the peat fire carefully stoked to emit a welcoming glow. Fraser and Maclean had been instructed to return to the house under the guise of cooperative observation. Hamish knew their behaviour would give away more than words, and he needed them present to draw out the truth. As the evening deepened, a faint movement caught his eye from the far edge of the property. A shadow slipped across the snow, cautious, calculating. Hamish did not move, allowing the figure to come closer, unconsciously leading them toward the room where he waited. The anticipation was precise. He had studied the psychology, traced the behavioral patterns, and now the final piece of the trap was in place. The door opened, just slightly at first, then fully as the intruder stepped inside. Hamish recognized the figure immediately, Mrs. Maclean. She froze in the doorway, eyes darting between Hamish and Fraser, lips pressed tight, posture rigid. Hamish remained calm, voice low and steady. "I see you've returned," he said quietly. "I imagine you thought the snow and the night would hide your movements. But it's always the small habits that betray us, isn't it? The timing, the glances, the way you approach a doorway, you cannot help yourself." Maclean's face tightened. You can't prove anything. And even if you could..." Her voice trailed off, uncertain whether to continue the threat or the bluff. Hamish stepped forward slowly, hands relaxed at his sides. "Proof is in the patterns you left behind, the minor details, the micro-expressions, the careful orchestration of Morag's absence, and the diary theft. Every act you thought clever only confirms what I already suspected. You wanted control, influence, the thrill of manipulating perception itself, and now your own mind has led you here. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, in a sudden, desperate motion, Maclean lunged toward the desk, attempting to snatch a loose sheet of ledger from the top. Hamish sidestepped easily, the peat fire illuminating the frantic glint in her eyes. "It's too late," he said softly, watching her shoulders slump as the realization of futility settled. Fraser, standing nearby, shifted uneasily. Hamish's gaze flicked toward him, noting the mix of fear and relief, then returned to Maclean. "You see, control is an illusion," he continued. "The tighter you grip, the more you reveal. Every detail you tried to hide, every interaction you calculated, has led us here. You cannot manipulate the pattern any longer." Maclean sank into a chair, defeated, the veneer of composure finally stripped away. I only wanted to show that it could be done," she whispered, "that things could be arranged, and everyone would follow without noticing. I never wanted anyone hurt." Hamish studied her, letting the words settle. "And yet, in orchestrating the disappearance, the stolen diary, and the staged evidence, you put lives at risk. You underestimated observation, patience, and the weight of human instinct. That is why we are here, and why the truth has come to light." Fraser exhaled, visibly relieved. "So, it's over?" he asked quietly. "For now," Hamish replied, voice steady, measured. "The pattern is complete, the motives revealed, and the orchestrator exposed. But remember, control is fleeting, and the human mind, no matter how clever, cannot outpace careful attention forever." Maclean's shoulders sagged, the fight drained from her body. Hamish watched her, noting the final, subtle gestures, the ones that confirmed both her guilt and the complexity of her psychology. The long game was over. The threads had been traced, the pattern recognized, and the hidden motives revealed. And through it all, Hamish Macbeth had remained composed, patient, and unshaken, allowing the careful orchestration of a mind obsessed with control to finally collapse under the weight of its own design. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the first faint whispers of a new day. The snow lay undisturbed, and in the quiet of the village, the resolution of one tangled mystery promised the clarity of truth finally restored. The village had begun to exhale, as if relieved that Morag's disappearance, the stolen diary, and the shadowed manipulations had finally been resolved. The snow, brittle and sparkling under the pale dawn light, masked the tension that had gripped Lochdu for days. Hamish Macbeth stood in Morag's sitting room, watching Mrs. Maclean escorted to the constable's sleigh. Fraser lingered behind the doorway, shoulders relaxed for the first time, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The case, it seemed, had reached its conclusion, yet Hamish felt the familiar tug of unease, something about the patterns, the subtle orchestrations, the careful timing, though exposed, left a residue of doubt in his mind. He retraced the steps of the last confrontation in his thoughts, Maclean's desperation, her precise mimicry of Morag's habits, the way Fraser had unconsciously mirrored her tension. Everything fit but too neatly, too perfectly. Real crime, he knew, rarely allowed for such tidy resolution. He moved toward the study, picking up the ledger fragment that had first hinted at coded messages. As his fingers brushed the paper, he noticed something he had not before, a faint crease along the edge, barely perceptible. It suggested the page had been folded and unfolded several times, as if someone had been consulting it repeatedly while planning the orchestration. He frowned. The handwriting was familiar, but not Maclean's, not Fraser's. A sudden memory struck him. A casual remark from the constable days earlier, when he had remarked almost jokingly about how villagers always know more than they let on. At the time, Hamish had dismissed it as idle observation. Now the offhand comment gained weight, a subtle signpost pointing away from the apparent orchestrators towards someone entirely unexpected. Hamish's gaze swept the room, lingering on the faint scorch marks near the fireplace, previously overlooked. They were minimal, almost invisible, mere hints of something burned, but they carried a smell he recognized, a chemical used in ink preservation. Someone had been tampering with documents, not just stealing the diary, but also creating diversions, testing reactions, and planting clues to mislead him. And the precision? That level of foresight suggested a mind accustomed to observation, manipulation, and subtle control, a mind he had seen interacting with him every day, unnoticed. He turned abruptly toward the door, just as the constable returned, a messenger's note in hand. The constable seemed unremarkable, casual, the embodiment of helpfulness, but now Hamish's instincts flared. The handwriting on the note, ostensibly from a villager reporting a new sighting of Maclean, was faintly familiar. Hamish unfolded it carefully. The letter's language, the phrasing, the deliberate errors, they matched none of the villagers. It matched the constable's own private handwriting, the very same he had seen during quiet moments of note-taking. Hamish's heart quickened, not from fear, but from the thrill of realization. The constable, so eager to close the case, so quick to hail Fraser and Maclean as guilty, had been guiding the investigation from behind a veil of trust. Every misstep, every staged evidence, every behavioral test. He had been manipulating them, orchestrating the narrative to maintain control, even when the more obvious criminals seemed exposed. The real mastermind had been observing from within the investigation itself, adjusting the story in real time, ensuring that attention was focused elsewhere while the threads of deceit moved exactly as he desired. He stepped forward as the constable approached, voice calm, measured. Interesting, isn't it, how the obvious can hide the truth? How someone who appears to follow, to assist, to serve the law, can be the one directing the story from behind the curtain? The constable froze, the first flicker of unease crossing a face that had seemed unflappable. Hamish continued slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of his observations press, the diary's disappearance, Mrs. Maclean's vanishing, the pattern of micro-expressions. They were all guided, subtly nudged. You made sure attention never landed where it should, but even the most careful manipulations leave traces. The folded paper, the subtle chemical, the handwriting, all small, but enough. Enough to reveal the mind behind the chaos. The constable's lips tightened, a shadow of panic flashing in his eyes. Hamish did not move, did not raise his voice. The room was silent except for the faint hiss of the peat fire. He had tracked the pattern, predicted the motive, exposed the manipulations. And now, for the first time, the game had turned entirely. The true mastermind, confident until this moment, was finally confronted, and Hamish Macbeth's genius, tempered by patience and relentless observation, was the final obstacle they could not outmaneuver. Outside, the snow continued to fall silently, unmarked by the footsteps of deceit. Inside, the last-minute twist had emerged from the shadows, and the resolution of Lochdu's tangled mystery hung on the delicate balance of truth, observation, and the unyielding logic of one man who saw everything others failed to notice. Hamish stood in the quiet of Morag's sitting room, watching the constable's face shift from confidence to realization, and finally, to a tight-lipped acknowledgement that his carefully constructed facade had crumbled. Outside, the snow drifted silently, blanketing the village in an almost serene calm that contrasted sharply with the storm of deception that had passed within these walls. Hamish's mind traced each thread, each subtle manipulation, and every gesture that had gone unnoticed by those eager to declare the case closed. "Do you see now?" Hamish said softly, voice even, controlled. The diary, the ash circle, the stopped watch, none of it was random. Each piece was designed to mislead, to create a false narrative that drew suspicion away from the true orchestrator. Mrs. Maclean and Fraser were pieces on the board, not the players moving the game. The constable's eyes flicked nervously toward the window. "But if you knew all along, why didn't you stop them sooner?" Hamish shook his head, letting the faint firelight highlight the creases in his brow. Because knowing is one thing, proving is another. Observation, patience, and the careful study of behavior were the tools that revealed the truth. Every hesitation, every micro-expression, every incongruity led me to you. You underestimated how much a single observer could see when watching with attention rather than assumption. The constable swallowed, realizing the weight of Hamish's words. He had attempted to control the narrative, to orchestrate outcomes from within the investigation itself, confident in his ability to hide behind trust, but in doing so, he had left subtle traces. The folded ledger page, the chemical smudge on the hearth, the handwriting disguised as others' notes, that betrayed his involvement. Hamish stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You believed manipulation of the obvious would conceal the subtle. But human behavior is not so easily commanded. Even under stress, under deception, small actions reveal intent. That is why the pattern emerged, and why the final twist became clear." For a moment the constable said nothing. Then, with a sudden shift, he made a move toward the door, swift and desperate, as though the snow and shadows could shield him from the consequences. Hamish's reflexes were measured, precise. A step to the side, a hand extended, not in force but in warning, and the constable froze, realization finally anchoring him. Escape was no longer possible, the truth had caught up. "Do you understand why it failed?" Hamish asked, voice calm, almost gentle. "The very habits, the tiny inconsistencies you relied upon to manipulate others betrayed you. Observation, patience, and human instinct do not forget. You were one step ahead of everyone else, yes, but not of me." Outside, Fraser and Mrs. Maclean, no longer suspects but witnesses to the unravelling of the scheme, watched silently. Relief softened their faces, but the knowledge that the constable had operated with such precision and cunning within the investigation itself left an unsettling weight. The village, though momentarily at peace, had narrowly avoided another layer of chaos. Hamish gestured to the diary, finally returned to its rightful place on the shelf. "See this?" he said. It seemed insignificant at first. A simple book, a blank page, a minor habit. Yet within these small details lay the truth, if one knew how to look. The ash, the stopped watch, the subtle smudges, all overlooked by those too quick to assume simplicity. The truth has been revealed, but only because no detail was too small, no hesitation too trivial. The constable, now restrained and subdued, could only meet Hamish's gaze. There was no defiance left, only the recognition of skill, patience, and the keen understanding that had exposed him. Justice, in this case, had been served, but not in the way the village had expected. The true villain had almost slipped away, hidden in plain sight, relying on the trust others placed in him. It was a reminder that even in a small, quiet village, clever minds could create chaos if left unchecked. Hamish stepped back from the confrontation, breathing in the cold, crisp air that drifted through the slightly open window. He turned toward Fraser and Maclean, explaining in quiet tones the hidden clues, the behavioural signs, and the subtle details that had led him to see what everyone else had missed. Their eyes widened with a mixture of awe and relief as Hamish outlined the invisible threads, the micro-expressions, and the tiny manipulations that had built a nearly perfect, deception. As he spoke, the snow continued to fall, each flake settling silently on rooftops and fields, leaving behind a pristine surface, a stark contrast to the complex web of human psychology that had just been unravelled within the village. Justice had been delivered, the true villain exposed, yet the memory of how close chaos had come left an echo, a subtle reminder that vigilance and careful observation were the only shields against the clever and the cunning. Hamish Macbeth, patient, perceptive and unfaltering, had once again proven that no detail was too small to escape notice, and no mind, no matter how shrewd, could remain hidden forever. The snow had settled into an unbroken sheet of white as Hamish stepped out of Morag's house, the first pale light of morning catching on rooftops and frozen fields. The village was waking slowly, unaware of how close it had come to being ensnared in layers of deception and manipulation. Fraser walked beside him, grateful, relieved, yet still carrying the weight of having been caught in a web that had nearly pulled him under. Mrs. McLean had been taken into custody, the true villain unmasked, but even as the village exhaled, Hamish could not shake the faint stir of unease that always accompanied the resolution of a case. They walked in silence down the narrow lane toward the brae, the crunch of snow beneath their boots the only sound. Hamish's mind, however, was far from quiet. He traced the threads of the investigation again, replaying every detail, every subtle clue, every hesitation and gesture. Though justice had been served, a single thought tugged at him, a detail he had noticed in passing, but had not yet fully explained. Earlier, when he examined the torn ledger fragment, there had been a faint symbol in the corner, almost imperceptible, as if stamped lightly by someone with a steady hand. At the time, he had assumed it was a flourish, a meaningless mark, but now he wondered if it was more, a signature of some hidden network, a subtle hint pointing to someone beyond the village, perhaps another observer watching the same patterns from afar. The thought sent a familiar thrill through him. Even as the immediate danger had passed, there was the sense that this case was a single layer of something larger. Fraser noticed his faraway gaze and nudged him lightly. "Still thinking about it, Hamish?" He shook himself slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Always," he admitted. "The obvious resolutions are comforting, but mysteries are rarely complete. There's always a subtle motion, a whisper, a sign that we've missed, something small, easily overlooked, that may point toward the next challenge." The wind carried a whisper across the village green, rustling the bare branches of the trees like the soft warning of a distant voice. Hamish looked toward the hills, the expanse of white fields fading into shadow, and felt the familiar tug of anticipation. The truth of Morag's disappearance, the diary theft, and the orchestrations of the constable had been revealed. Yet he knew, as he always did, that the world contained layers of puzzles waiting patiently to be discovered. He paused near the bridge that overlooked the frozen river, watching a thin mist curl over the surface. A faint scrap of paper, half buried in the snow, caught his eye. He knelt, brushing away the powdery frost, and uncovered a single symbol, similar to the mark he had noticed in the ledger fragment, though this one was sharper, deliberate, and newly placed. Hamish's eyes narrowed. The placement was intentional, almost taunting, as if the next challenge had already been laid before him, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. Fraser leaned over his shoulder. "What is it?" Hamish straightened slowly, the faintest glimmer of a smile on his face. "A reminder," he said softly, "that no matter how neatly a case appears to close, there's always more lurking beneath. Someone wants to be noticed, or perhaps they're testing the pattern, seeing if we can follow it. Either way, the game is far from over. The constable, previously unmasked, had been taken away, the village's immediate danger resolved. Yet as Hamish pocketed the scrap of paper, he realized that a single thread had already begun to pull at the edges of the familiar. There were questions unanswered, hints unpursued, and small signals left in plain sight that only a careful eye could discern. As he continued along the snow-lined path, the village fading behind him, Hamish felt the comforting weight of certainty and the persistent thrill of the unknown. The day was calm, the immediate danger past, but somewhere, in the subtle frost, the quiet hills, and the silent streets of Loch Dhu, another mystery was waiting, patient, intricate, and unseen. Hamish Macbeth's steps were measured, deliberate, each one carrying him further from the resolution and closer to the questions that would inevitably follow. Justice had been delivered, the villains revealed, yet the snow-covered village held its secret still, and as he walked toward the distant hills, he allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The case was closed, for now. Mysteries, like shadows in the snow, never truly end.